Good evening. My name is Veronika Levin, and I'm a board member of the Society for the History of Czech. Can you hear me?
Now, yep.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah, that's better. Okay. I'm a board member of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews. And on behalf of the board, and with grateful acknowledgement of support from the Consulate General of the Slovak Republic in New York and of the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, I welcome you all here today as we continue the series we launched nearly 3 years ago on Jews in literature from the Czech lands and Slovakia. This series covers diverse topics in literature both by and about Czech and Slovak Jews. And before we continue, I'd like to introduce Mr. Milan Verbovsky, who is the Consul General of the Slovak Republic here in New York. And he'll say a few words.
Thank you. And first of all, I have to apologize for being overdressed, but I just came from the office. Anyway, so of course I want to begin by thanking both the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews and BBLA for organizing this, I would say, important event, this lecture and debate on topic that remains part of our history and will be part of our future if not addressed properly, if I may say that. I heard a lot about Julia Sherwood, I have to say. Unfortunately, so far we haven't had a chance to meet, but we share a lot of friends, we share a lot of fellows. We also share interest in Shoah, in Holocaust, and the history of this event, and also the phenomena of anti-Semitism, which I don't want to brag, but I dealt with it in my academic career and also published a book on anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that it's a good book, but I did. I tried. I did my best. Anyway, so but before I give the floor to Julia, and we just discuss it. Allow me a personal side note. When I went through the synopsis or the description of the event, and I saw the list of authors that somehow reflected on Shoah in Slovak literature, I was and I'm saying that with all the respect, I was missing one name, and it's Jan Johanides. And the reason why I'm trying to put him on the list, I mean not tonight or not today, but maybe in the future, is so the reason is not that I like him so much, and it's one of my favorite authors, but also I believe in his overall artistic value and his artistic depiction of the tragic events of Holocaust. So, and I also believe that when it comes to his art, he goes much beyond the borders of Slovakia or Czech Republic. So, thank you and enjoy the evening. Thanks.
Okay, so today's talk will focus on Slovak literature. Specifically, it will trace the presentation of the Shoah in diverse literary forms in post-war communist Czechoslovakia and present-day Slovakia. The treatment of the Shoah in Slovak literature has today been sparsely investigated, and I'm delighted that today's speaker, Julia Sherwood, will tackle this topic. Julia Sherwood is a prolific and award-winning translator, curator, publisher, and promoter of Slovak literature in the English-speaking world. Many of you met Julia virtually 1 year ago when she and two interlocutors engaged in a fascinating discussion about her mother's, Agnieszka Kalinova's, best-selling memoir, which Julia had translated into English. Julia was born and raised in Bratislava, from where she was forced to emigrate in 1978. She studied English and Slavic languages and literatures at universities of Cologne, Munich, and London, where she now lives. After working for many years for Amnesty International, Julia turned to literary translation from and into Slovak, Czech, Polish, Russian, and English. Her translations have been published by leading independent publishing houses in the UK and an academic press here in the US. And now please join me in welcoming Julia Sherwood.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Society for this kind invitation to give this talk. And I would just like to say that when I started preparing it, I drew up a list of all the books that deal with the topic of the Shoah, and I was frankly overwhelmed. There is really so much in terms of fiction, non-fiction, drama, but also a huge number of academic books, especially published recently. So I realized that it's impossible to do justice to all of that within the scope of this 1 hour lecture. So I decided to focus on what is closest to my heart, and that is fiction, and also a place for the theater. And preparing for this talk was actually also a learning experience for me, because I don't consider myself an expert on either the Shoah or anti-Semitism. And it enabled me to explore this subject in much more detail. But I just have to mention that I'm not an academic, so I will be talking just as someone who loves reading. And I hope you won't mind if at times I get quite personal, because some of the issues that I'm going to mention actually touch on my personal family history. So, in the talk, as you saw in the write-up, I set out to compare how the Shoah is reflected in literary works written in the immediate aftermath or soon after the end of the war, on the one hand, and how more recent authors have perceived the subject on the other. I would like to start with a brief outline of the political and cultural context in which they were written. But for more detailed outline and analysis, I would like to refer you to the publication, the Handbook of Czech, Polish, and Slovak Holocaust Fiction, which was published in 2011, and it's actually available to download on the internet for free. And you received these sheets, and the handout here at the back has list of literature and resources, so the details of this book are in there. And also, if you don't catch some of the names that I mention, you will find them all there. So, about the historical overview, as is well known, after the communist takeover in 1948, the atmosphere was not conducive to discussions of the Holocaust, not just in Czechoslovakia, but everywhere in Eastern and Central Europe. Anti-Semitism was an intrinsic part of the communist ideology, and the Shoah, the whole subject, was generally subsumed within the collective suffering, especially that by communists and anti-Nazi resistance. This changed briefly during the Prague Spring, and it started really with the Kafka conference held in Liblice in 1963. There was a talk for the Society by Veronika Homolová on this subject, I think last year. But this surfacing of Jewish themes in literature, film, and television was brought to an abrupt end by the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And the era of normalization that followed brought a renewed wave of anti-Semitism. The Shoah became once again a taboo subject, and just to give you an example, for example, the film Cabaret was not actually shown in Czechoslovak cinemas, so I had to travel to Budapest to see it. 1970 saw the publication of the book Sionismus a Antisemitismus, written by František J. Kollár. And this book was later summarized in a 6-part series of articles in the communist daily Pravda under the signature of Jan Novák, which was probably a pseudonym of this Kollár himself. And just to give you a flavor of it, here's a quote from the second installment, which lambasts the return of, quote, notorious Jewish exaggerations and whining of a minority that had been oppressed for centuries. As a result, Zionist pseudo-humanism became a statutory part of Czech and Slovak literature and arts, unquote. And a personal aside, this article actually played a role in the life of my family, because in 1972 my parents were arrested and my father was later charged with incitement, and one of the charges against him was that he dared to say that this article was anti-Semitic, or these articles, which he used to joke afterwards that sentencing a Jew for claiming there's anti-Semitism is philo-Semitism taken to the extreme. Moving to literature, the Shoah features in several works written by Czech authors immediately after the war, but fewer Slovak writers dealt with the subject. They focused more on the Slovak national uprising against the Nazis, and this continued even into the 1950s and 1960s. Furthermore, constraints imposed by socialist realism forced writers to foreground class struggle and focus on the role of the communists. However, there are about a dozen books by Slovak authors published between 1945 and 1989 that deal with the subject of the Shoah. Some touch upon it, others discuss it at greater depth. And I will look in some detail at the work of 4 writers. And so here I have to come back to what Mr. Consul has said. I'm not going to be covering Jan Iohannides because although the subject of the Shoah does feature in his books, it's not the central theme. And I have also left out some books where it is more central because just simply for time reasons. So I will be looking in more detail at the work of 4 writers in this after post-war period. They were born between 1918 and 1921. And they were almost exact contemporaries, but their lives and careers followed very different trajectories, and they reflected their experience in very different ways. So they are Ladislav Grosman, Rudolf Jašík, Leopold Lahola, and Alfréd Wetzler. I will begin with Rudolf Jašík, the only one of these 4 writers who was not of Jewish origin. Because his novel Náměstí svätej Alžbety, St. Elizabeth Square, was published in 1958, some years before the works by the other writers were published. And it is the first substantial Slovak literary work in which the Shoah plays a central role. A film adaptation released in 1968 starred the then very young Emilia Vášariová, now a beloved Slovak actor, and the book appeared in English translation in 1964. Rudolf Jašík was born in the Kysuce region in the northeast of Slovakia. In 1940, he was drafted into the Slovak army, fought at the Eastern Front, but he was a pacifist and was court-martialed for sabotage. After being amnestied, he returned to Slovakia and took part in the Slovak national uprising. After the war, he worked as a journalist and in the cultural sphere and was an active member of the Communist Party. St. Elizabeth's Square is set in an unnamed town under the hill of the Vineyard, which can be easily identified as Nitra, some 60 miles east of Bratislava. Most of the action takes place in a poor neighborhood around the square dominated by the Church of St. Elizabeth, and it begins in the fall of 1941, just as the Jews are ordered to wear the Star of David. And it is a Romeo and Juliet type tale of a doomed love between an 18-year-old Slovak boy called Igor and a Jewish girl, 17-year-old Eva, whose father Samko delivers coal on a horse-drawn cart that he shares with a friend. This Igor is quite oblivious of the dark clouds gathering above the Jews, until on a rendezvous at the top of the church tower, Eva tells him what's happening. Igor offers to marry her, and she defies her parents by converting and marrying him, but this doesn't really help her because most of the Jewish population of the town is rounded up and bundled and marched through town to be bundled onto cattle trucks and deported. And Eva is shot dead by an SS officer along with 2 other Jewish youngsters during an act of protest. And her parents commit suicide, and the final pages of the book suggests that Igor will join the communist resistance. The book enjoys the status of a modern classic and is regarded as a late example of what's known as lyrical prose that flourished in Slovakia between the 2 wars. However, it has aged very badly, in my view. The style, to me, is more socialist realism than lyrical prose, and the lyrical passages consist mostly of the descriptions of the tolling of church bells, and the poetic effect wears thin as the motive is endlessly repeated until it feels trite and cliched. The portrayal of the young couple lacks psychological depth, and Igor's complete cluelessness about the political situation seems quite implausible. More disturbingly, I find the book was riddled with historical inaccuracies. While a degree of freedom in depicting historical events is justified in a work of fiction, I think that Jašík goes too far, and he distorts several key facts. So, for example, he states several times that Slovak Jews had to wear the Star of David because of the Nuremberg laws. But he never mentions the Slovak government's decree of the 18th of September 1941, which in turn was based on the Jewish Codex, which, yes, was modeled on the Nuremberg laws, but it was an indigenous Slovak legislation. The novel also gets some of its dates wrong. The local Jews are rounded up and deported very soon after being made to wear the Star of David, so that suggests that this is still in the autumn of 1941. But in fact, the deportations didn't begin until the spring of the following year. And although the novel does feature some members of the Hlinka Guard who join out of opportunism or out of greed, in that seminal scene of the rounding up of the Jews, they are mostly passive. And the active role in Jašík's version, the whole thing is organized by an SS unit stationed in town and a contingent of German soldiers, even though Slovakia was not actually under German occupation at the time. And the Hlinka Guard were willing agents of the deportations. While cleaving closely to the facts and without any unnecessary literary flourishes or attempts to tug at heartstrings and sensationalize the account, Escape from Hell is a thrilling read, demonstrating Wetzler's literary talent. The scenes depicting the time the escapees spent crouching in a hideout vividly conjure up the existential fear and the physical demands placed on them. The book was discovered overseas when a distant relative in Oxford, Peter Varnay, initiated the English translation, which was published with an afterword by the distinguished Holocaust scholar Sir Martin Gilbert, and an introduction by Yad Vashem librarian Dr. Robert Rosert. Finally, it appeared in Slovakia under the real name of this, quote, uncherished author and unintentional hero, unquote, as Ivan Kamenec calls Wetzler in his afterword to the Slovak edition. And the film also served as the basis of a 2021 Slovak feature film Správa, which I think was released under the title The Auschwitz Report. According to Wetzler's daughter, Táňa Kernová, Her father had kept all his life the list of those who died in the Shoah. After he died, she found the following note in her father's hand, quote, "They died helpless, but they have continued to live on in me," unquote. And with this book, which we are lucky to have available in both Slovak and English, Alfréd Wetzler will continue to live on in us too. And it is well worth reading. Although Wetzler was not an acclaimed writer like Jašík, his Escape from Hell is well-paced and reads like a thriller and convinces by its authenticity. Now, of the 4 authors of the immediate post-war cohort, the name of Ladislav Grosman is probably the one most familiar to readers outside Czechoslovakia, because he's the author of the novella Obchod na Korze, The Shop on Main Street, which he adapted as the script of the first Czechoslovak movie to win an Academy Award in 1965. Although Grosman wrote mostly in Czech, I have included him in this talk because his stories depict the vanished life of the Slovak Jewry. Ladislav Grosman was born in Humenné, a small town on the easternmost edge of Slovakia, which had a sizable Jewish community, and incidentally it was also the birthplace of Andy Warhol's mother. He was called up for unarmed military service and later taken to a forced labor camp and spent the final year of the war in hiding, returning to Humenné after the liberation to discover that his parents and 3 of his 5 siblings had perished. He moved to Prague, where he graduated in politics, followed by studies in education, and worked as newspaper and publishing editor, and started publishing journals, first in Slovak and later switching to Czech. And later, encouraged by the success of The Shop on Main Street, he turned to script writing. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968, Grosman emigrated to Israel with his family and taught at Bar Ilan University near Tel Aviv. And by the time he died in 1981, he had published another book with the Czech Exile Press Index, and his final work, the novel Adam, remained unfinished. So Grosman is best known for these 2 novellas set in a small town modeled on Humenné on the eve of deportations. Obchod na Korze, The Shop on Main Street, started life as a short story entitled The Trap, Pasca, and Grosman expanded it while working on a film script, publishing it in 1966. Most of you will have seen the film, so just to remind you, it tells the tragicomic story of Tono Brtko, a hapless Slovak carpenter who reorganizes a haberdashery shop, and he's browbeaten into it by his greedy and domineering wife. Trapped between his wife's demands for money and his basic human decency, Brtko's moral dilemma culminates as the deportations begin. Panicking and drunken, he pushes Mrs. Altmanova into a closet, inadvertently killing her, and then he hangs himself. The Oscar-winning film was a truly Czechoslovak product. It was directed by the Slovak Jan Kadar and the Czech Elmar Klos, and with Slovak dialogue and Slovak actors, most notably Josef Kroner, and also one Polish one, the Ida Kamińska as Mrs. Lautmanová. The other novella, Nevěsta, the Bride, is less known, but also been translated into English, and it introduces us to the plucky seamstress Lízinka, who is giving her parents a headache by refusing to get married and remaining an old maid. When word of the impending registration of young unmarried women gets around, Lízinka agrees to a hastily arranged sham marriage to a sickly young man named Poťu. As the mass wedding organized for her and 16 other girls at the register office appears not to stay off the danger, a rabbi is prevailed upon to hold a proper Jewish wedding for all 17 couples. To everyone's surprise, Lízinka takes the charade seriously and gets all excited about her marriage. The story is told in a light-hearted and jocular tone, and the horror lurking in the background only breaks through at the end when the girl is forced into hiding. The Bride appeared in a collection of 7 stories, which astonishingly was published in 1969 when Grosman was already in Israel. And although it was reissued a year later, sharing a volume with The Shop on Main Street, the Oscar-winning movie was banned as one of the directors, Jan Kadar, also emigrated to the US. And this series of rabidly anti-Semitic Pravda articles I mentioned earlier illustrate the official attitude. So the second installment of the articles contains a lengthy attack on the film, which claims that, quote, a much larger role than any artistic value of the film had was played by someone quite unknown to Czechoslovak public, a Madame de Marais of New York, an arts and cultural agent. It is indisputable that if The Shop on Main Street did not focus on the Jewish theme in wartime Slovakia in the class unconscious and one-sidedly distorted way that it did, it would never have got an Oscar, unquote. Fortunately, the classic The Shop on the Main Street is available as a remastered DVD, and both stories have appeared in English. And Ladislav Grosman's stories still enchant today, thanks to their gentle humor and humanism and vivid evocation of traditional Jewish life in Eastern Slovakia that has been wiped out by the Shoah. Leopold Lahola, the final member of the post-war quartet I focus on here, may be the least known in the US, although I very much hope that this will change in a not distant future. Lahola, a playwright, film director, screenwriter, poet, essayist, and author of short stories, was born Arie Friedman in Prešov and grew up in Orava. As a student at a gymnasium in Bratislava, he started writing poetry, as well as essays on literature and publishing them in literary journals. When he was expelled from university, he was drafted into a labor battalion from where he escaped. However, in 1942, on learning that his mother and younger brother were interned in Nováky, he smuggled himself into the camp. And in September that year, when his loved ones were selected for a transport to Auschwitz, he was intent on joining them, but was prevented by his friends. In Nováky, he met his first wife, with whom he escaped and joined the resistance, later becoming a reporter with Czechoslovak army newspapers. After the war, Lahola made his name as a playwright, with several plays staged by the National Theatre in Bratislava, and he worked as a scriptwriter at the Slovak Film Studios at Koliba. But after the 1948 communist takeover, contemporary critics didn't take kindly to Lahola's worldview. His fourth play, Attentat, Assassination, was denounced as existentialist, and it gave rise to a vicious campaign that ultimately led to the author's emigration to Israel with his second wife by then. And in the following 2 decades, Lahola wrote film and TV scripts and directed feature films in Israel and later in West Germany, including writing the script for, some of you may have read Karl May's westerns, so the film The Treasure of the Silver Lake. He was actually supposed to direct it, but in the end he just wrote the script. In 1957, he moved to Austria and then settled in Munich with his third wife, a German. During the Prague Spring, he started visiting Czechoslovakia. His plays were staged again. He was rediscovered. He embarked on film and TV projects, and his short stories were published for the first time in the collection Posledná věc. The literal translation is The Last Thing, a title that proved sadly prophetic, as Lahola's career was cut short by his premature death in January 1968, shortly before his 50th birthday. Lahola was haunted by his wartime experiences. His characters find themselves in archetypal situations of extreme moral or existential choices, grappling with issues of cruelty and humanity. Set mostly in Slovakia during World War II and written between 1945 and 1956, the stories in this collection Posledná vec were not published until 1968. I think actually a better translation would be the final service based on the actual content of the story of that title. Despite spending nearly half of his life in exile, Lahola never stopped being a Slovak writer, unlike authors such as Konrad or Nabokov, who embraced the language of their adopted country. I will now speak in more detail about 6 of Lahola's short stories in this collection. Sorry. Still there. 2 of them, Božia ulička, God's Alley, and Vtáčí spev, Bird Song, written in 1948, focus on the predicament of Jews living in the Slovak clerofascist state. God's Alley is the street in the Jewish quarter of a small town whose inhabitants receive word of an impending pogrom. The attitude of the majority of the Jewish population resigned to awaiting their fate passively is juxtaposed to that of Dufi, a wrestler who encourages them to stand up to the mob. A few young people choose to follow him, even though they know that their attempt at resistance is doomed. In Bird Song, a Jewish lawyer called Vogel runs into a fascist patrol in the street and is subjected to unspeakable cruelty at the hands of a sadistic Hlinka gardist. Anyone who wished had the right to stop him and ask any questions they liked. So it came as no surprise when one of the men asked for his identification papers. As he was getting his pass out of his pocket, he braced himself, ready to be made to crawl home on his knees or on all fours, something that would not be so much physically demanding as enormously humiliating. But others before him had managed, so he too was sure to manage. He no longer cared what happened and prepared himself for whatever humiliation or mockery they had in store, although he still harbored a secret hope that they might not manhandle a graying 50-year-old educated man as they might someone else. Yet nothing prepares him for what follows, because when this gardist learns that his name is Vogel, he orders him to climb up into a tree and sing like a bird. 2 further undated stories, Otvorené dvere, The Open Door, and 25 palíc, 25 blows, are set in a concentration camp in Slovakia. And I think maybe I won't go into the detail because of time, but I'll just move on to the last 2 stories. Ako taký pes, Like a Kind of Dog, written in 1951, and Pohreb Davida Krakovera, The Funeral of David Krakauer, written in 1953. They focus on the survivor experience and survivor trauma. In the first story, clearly inspired by what Lahola himself went through, a demobbed officer returns to his hometown to find strangers now living in his family's apartment. And in the Funeral of David Krakauer, a man named Keldich, a survivor of a mass shooting at a camp, flies to New York 3 years after the end of the war and seeks out David Krakauer, a man who made a fortune from recordings of Hebrew liturgical songs. Keldich reminds Krakauer that the latter had saved his own life by volunteering to sing God Full of Mercy over the pit into which his fellow prisoners were shot. Keldich himself was wounded, but managed to scramble out and survive. Now he has come to kill Krakauer as revenge for turning the mass murder into a ceremony. And he explains, I quote, I can't forgive, Keldich replied nervously. You see, Krakauer, I should be down there with those in the pit. If there's something I know how to do, it's to rot and decay. My mouth is filled with lime, and I can't utter words of comfort. I can't forgive or show mercy. Leopold Lahola's harrowing stories deserve to be better known outside Slovakia, as they raise important questions of moral responsibility and dignity in a very compelling way, and also for their striking imagery and originality of language. And there is now a chance that there will be an English edition of his short stories in a few years. So moving on to the next period, the post-communist period, what, if anything, has changed since 1989 in the way the subject of the Shoah has been reflected? In fact, so much has changed that I will speak a little more broadly this time about the changes in the cultural and social discourse before moving on to literature, which necessarily will be covered in slightly less depth than in the first half. So, as we all know, the devastation caused by the war was further deepened by decades of neglect under communism, and nothing illustrates this better than the last folio exhibition, which had traveled the world and which some of you may have seen because it was also shown in New York and Washington, D.C. The Slovak-born Canadian photographer Juri Deutsch captured these stunning images while traveling through Slovakia between 2005 and 2014, together with producer Katka Krausová. And he portrayed Holocaust survivors and captures images of ruined synagogues, neglected cemeteries, and disintegrating books left on the shelves of the Jewish school in Bardejov. This gave the exhibition its name. And during 2 recent visits to Slovakia, I took these pictures. This is the Neolog cemetery in Prešov, which is used as a hardware store. And these are Jewish cemeteries in Skalica and Varín. In general, though, Jewish life in Czechoslovakia slowly began to recover after 1989. Oral testimonies of survivors were collected, many memoirs published, including an unprecedented number of translations of books from other languages. Conferences have been held, and older historians, as well as a new generation of writers and researchers, have tackled the subject of Slovak complicity in and responsibility for the Holocaust. And some of you will have seen Madeleine Badkerty's Zoom talk to the Society last year on her groundbreaking research into hitherto neglected archive materials, and her book, Slovutný pán prezident, Your Honor, Mr. President. But also on my recent trip to Slovakia, I was very pleased to see that several synagogues have been repaired and now serve as venues for cultural events. So this is the synagogue in Lučenec with a modern art exhibition. And this is the new synagogue in Žilina. And there has been a great revival of Jewish culture. So just a few examples. There is in music, there's the Pressburger Klezmer Band, and my personal favorite, the Moshe Band. Then there is an internet channel, Tachles TV. Then a truly excellent podcast called a Kosher Podcast. Then the site of the former concentration camp in Sereď was turned into a museum. And Bratislava now boasts 2 Jewish museums, and the community is served by 2 rabbis, a liberal and an Orthodox one. However, this does not necessarily mean that Slovakia has fully acknowledged and come to terms with the role that the majority population played in the tragedy of Slovak Jews. And although the Slovak government has recently publicly apologized, anti-Semitism is raising its ugly head once again in Slovakia, but also in this country, unfortunately. And with neo-Nazi groupings that dismiss or deny the Holocaust, which started out on the fringes, have gradually entered the political mainstream, currently not just one, but two parties that glorify the Slovak puppet state and push a revisionist version of history are represented in Slovak parliament. A number of works that has appeared since 1989 deals with the subject of the Shoah, and their literary qualities vary, and there isn't time, again, to cover everything in sufficient detail, so I will limit myself to a brief survey of some selected prose works and plays for the theatre. Dom Hluchého, The House of the Deaf Man, a novel by Petr Krištúfek, portrays a man who collaborated with every regime, including Slovak fascists. Jana Bodnárová's Náhrdelník obojok, Necklace Choker, features a Jewish artist and shows the impact of the Holocaust on the next generation, and both these books are available in English. But the author who has reached the widest readership is TV journalist Veronika Homolová Tóthová, on the top right, with the real-life story of Viola Sternfischerová, who survived medical experiments by the notorious Dr. Mengele and 4 concentration camps. Homolová Tóthová turned her life into a very readable novel called Mengeleho dievča, Mengele's Girl. Viola Sternfischerová died in May 2017, aged 94, and by the end of that year, the book has sold 67,000 copies, an extraordinary figure for a reader market the size of Slovakia. The book topped that year's bestseller list, outselling Joe Nesbo and the prolific Slovak crime writer Dominik Dán. I could also mention Denisa Fulmeková's Cornvalia, Lily of the Valley, but there's really not time for everything. Now, many artists and writers reacted to the glorification of people like Josef Tiso, the president of wartime Slovakia, and Andrej Hlinka. Now, during my August visit to Slovakia, I saw this huge statue of Andrej Hlinka in the main square in Žilina. Then there is also a plaque commemorating the Declaration of Slovak autonomy, and in the nearby village of Varín, a street has been named after Tiso. During the 2015 refugee crisis, the young artist Ivana Šáteková created an embroidery called Horehajl Dolehajl, just at the top, showing the wonderful welcome little Slovak people give to refugees. More recently, artist Ilona Nemet has created an installation called Keď, Then. It's a variation on the well-known quote from Martin Niemöller, "First they came for." In his novel Nedeľné šachy s Tisom, Playing Chess with Tiso, writer Silvester Lavrík made the President Tiso a character who enjoys playing chess with a fictitious pharmacist in his former parish of Bánovce nad Bebravou, who continues to play chess with him even after he becomes president. The book's naive, childlike narrator Anička initially idealizes Tiso, but her eyes gradually open as she becomes aware of the brutality of the regime and its impact on the Jews. Lavrík used authentic documents, taking every single line that Tiso utters in the book verbatim from his speeches and sermons. And most recently, the disgraced president and the trial sentencing him to death in 1947 are at the center of the novel Proces s mrtvým, Trial of a Dead Man. Its author, Mariana Čengel-Solčanská, who is primarily a film director, drew on her family background, combined with archive materials and recollections of Tiso's defense counsel and one of his prosecutors. I was struck how many plays in recent years have dealt with the subject of the Shoah, so I will now concentrate on the theatre. And in these plays, the authors probe the role played by Slovak officials and intellectuals. This, again, would be material for a complete separate talk in its own right, ideally by a theatre scholar or critic. I'm neither, and also unfortunately I've only managed to see one of these plays on stage, so I can only speak on the basis of reading the texts. Rastislav Balek's play Tiso was commissioned by the Arena Theatre in Bratislava. 90% of Balek's play consists of verbatim quotes from Tiso, showing his evolution from a socially conscious, nationalist, rabble-rousing priest to the man who made the deportations of the Jews possible, thus betraying his Christian principles, but remaining unrepentant to his last breath. Opening in 2005, the play garnered several theatre awards, including Best Actor for its lead, Marian Labuda, in the photo below. And it was voted the best production of the theatre season. And then it was revived with the role reprised by Marian Labuda's son, Marian Labuda Jr. However, the play also provoked some unexpected, unintended reactions, with some young people in the audience applauding Tiso's speeches and some even giving the Nazi salute. Rabinka, the woman rabbi by Anna Gruskova, who's a theatre and film director, playwright, screenwriter, theatre scholar and curator, was written in 2006. And it had its first airing in 2010, and a Slovak National Theatre production opened in 2012 to critical acclaim. And readings took place all around the world, including in this very venue, the Bohemian National Hall. So I don't need to say much about it, except that it is an imaginative retelling of the life of Gizi Fleischmann of Bratislava, one of the leaders of the working group, the Jewish resistance organization that worked to save Slovak Jews from the transports, and who was eventually deported herself to Auschwitz and murdered there. The final three plays I would like to talk about focus on on Slovak intellectuals who became entangled with the clero-fascist regime. Holocaust opened in 2012 at the Arena Theatre in Bratislava. It was written by Viliam Klimáček, a novelist, poet, founder of the theatre Gunagu, and a seasoned playwright with nearly 50 plays under his belt. Holocaust was inspired by a memoir, Ruka s vytetovaným číslom, The Arm with a Number Tattoo, by Hilda Hrabovecká, who was on the first transport to Auschwitz. Klimáček said that he was initially reluctant to contribute yet another work on the subject, but felt compelled to do so, quote, as a member of the majority nation who sent its Jewish fellow citizens to death and paid 500 Deutschmarks for each of them to boot, unquote. So, Klimáček's play centers on a fictitious poet, Ambros Králik, an Aryanizer who climbs the greasy pole and has to flee the country after the war. After 1989, his daughter returns from Argentina, hoping to restitute what she believes was her father's cafe, only to discover that he had stolen it from a Jewish widow. Klimáček clearly had fun penning his characters' trite poems, as well as writing pastiches of popular songs of the period. The author of Tichý bič, The Silent Whip, is the feminist writer, playwright, translator, and publisher Jana Juráňová. And this was not her first foray into the subject of the Shoah. She is the co-author of My 7 Lives, a book-length conversation with my mother, Agnieszka Kalinová, published in 2012. And some of you may have seen her in this Zoom presentation of the English translation. And it was a beguiling portrait of my mother's beloved cousin Edita, your aunt, who perished in the Holocaust, that inspired Juráňová's next book, Nevybavená záležitosť, Unfinished Business, about a Slovak woman who buys a house and after finding a portrait of an unknown beauty in the attic, sets out to find out the story behind it. But to come back to the play, The Silent Whip opened on the small stage of Slovak National Theatre in 2016. Its title plays on the title of a classic of Slovak literature, Živý bič, The Living Whip, by Milo Urban, who from 1941 to 1945 served as editor-in-chief of the daily Gardista, the official paper of the Hlinka Guard. The action takes place over several encounters between the aged author and his devoted wife, Zsoška, and a young editor who admires his writing. As the latter questions the writer about his past, it gradually transpires that the young man's father was a Jew whose life Milo Urban helped to save. Nevertheless, the young man is ultimately disillusioned by the writer's attempt to exculpate himself, for which Juráňová uses authentic quotes from Urban's articles. As she explained in an essay for the journal Asymptote, with this play she, quote, wanted to explore the question of how a writer, by all accounts neither a careerist nor an active Nazi, a distinguished author with keen social awareness and literary talent, could turn into a mouthpiece for fascist ideology, unquote. Antiquariat, the second-hand bookshop, the last play I'm going to talk about, so you won't have to last much longer, is by Ľuba Lesná, a playwright and writer, probably best known for her work as investigative journalist. She's the only one of those recent authors with a Jewish background. Most of her father's family perished in the Shoah. And she's the initiator and main organizer of the annual reading of names of Slovak Jews murdered in the Shoah, which was launched in 2009. Antiquariat is the only play I actually managed to see on stage. It premiered on the experimental stage of the Pavel Orsak Wetzler Theatre in 2019, and its successful run was interrupted by the pandemic, but it managed to tour Slovakia, and there were 2 well-received performances in Prague. The play focuses on the documented role that the well-known Slovak writer Ľudo Ondrejov, some of you may remember his books Bojnická mladosť, Bandit Youth, and Jerguš Lapin, played in the deportation of a family whose bookshop he aryanized. Ľuba Lesná developed it from a novella, her novella, which she based on a real-life story of Lidia Pivovarčiová, ne Steinerová, the daughter of the owners of the eponymous second-hand bookshop, and one of the few members of the extended bookselling Steiner family to have survived. As the play opens, the audience are treated to a talk by an enthusiastic guide about the wonderful writer Ondrejov. As the guide sings his praises, an audience member, in fact the actress playing Lidia Pivovarčiová, begs to differ and offers her side of the story by means of an imaginary encounter between her younger self as a nurse and Ondrejov as a dying old man in hospital, in which she challenges him to reveal his true character. The play really packs a punch, not least thanks to Emilia Vášariova's understated acting and magnetic stage presence. So to conclude, is there continuity between the way the Shoah was depicted in its immediate aftermath and the post-communist period, or is it all changed? Well, it depends on whether you tend to see your glass half full or half empty. On the one hand, there seems to be more change than continuity, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. The disappearance of political and ideological constraints after the end of communism meant that the Shoah is no longer a taboo subject. It is also quite natural that the survivors and witnesses had a different perspective on the subject than their children or grandchildren, while the former were trying to process an immediate raw experience, bear witness. The younger writers observed the events from a temporal as well as a personal distance. And although the earlier writers were not trying to exonerate the Slovaks, they focused mainly on the emotional experience of those caught up in the Holocaust, rather than seeking to apportion blame. The new generation, on the other hand, makes a point of probing the question of Slovak complicity and guilt and pointing the finger at those responsible. They are motivated not only by a desire for truth, but also attempt to counter the whitewashing of history and stem the resurgence of anti-Semitism and, let's call a spade, fascism. In the words of Jana Juráňová again, quote, "The problem with Slovak culture is not just that some of its representatives succumbed to one ideology or another, whether for opportunist reasons or out of naivete. We have a much graver problem. Our society is unwilling and unable to fully and profoundly come to terms with the legacy of either totalitarian regime." The resurgence of anti-Semitism in itself is a kind of continuity, although not of the desirable kind. On the other hand, on the positive side, the renaissance of Jewish life and culture I spoke of earlier, as well as the determination of the younger generation of writers, most of them not Jewish, to raise the subject, has begun to build a bridge between the present and the pre-war past. It has helped to revive the memory of the lost world of Slovak Jewry and begin to heal the rupture brought about by the Shoah. And there is also continuity in the sense that works by authors such as Alfréd Wetzler and Leopold Lahola have been reissued and appreciated in Slovakia. And one more nice little factoid. Do you remember the name of the young actress who played Eva in St. Elizabeth Square? It was Emilia Vášariová. And so here you see her age 23 in one of her first starring roles, and now aged 80 she plays Lidka Pivovarčiová in Ľuba Lesná's play Antikvariát. She's the one on the right. And I would like to end on a positive note. During a recent visit to Prešov, my mother's birth town, I was invited to a private view of an exhibition entitled Prázdna stolička, the empty chair, which was put together by teachers and students of Evangelické Collegium, the Lutheran college, to commemorate the 102 Jewish students who were expelled from the school in 1940. Only about a dozen of them survived. The survivors included my mother, who managed to escape the transports by fleeing to Hungary, where she hid in a convent. And initiatives like these are not only heartwarming, they also inspire faith in the endurance and continuity of human decency. Thank you for your attention.